By the way, Freud's line, Moses and monotheism, it's still the best line of all time. Because people ask about, like when I talk about anti-Semitism, we talk about it's a revolt against the national historic mission of the Jewish people to bring certain values to the world. So we understand in the pagan world why people were so opposed to Judaism, because we were demanding a certain moral code based on ethical monotheism. And even Hitler says, the Hitler Youth, the last line is, we want to be pagans once again. People say, why would Christians? They espouse, a faith that's based on. So Freud said it best. He said, the Christians don't hate the Jews for killing Jesus. They hate the Jews for giving them Jesus. And what does he mean? That requires explanation, because what he's saying is, it's when Christianity only paid lip service to Scripture and the values, but it was really like pagan at its core. So they resented it. When you finally get a Christian community like the evangelicals who believe the Bible and act morally and take it seriously, then they're the ones who actually act like Christians. Not sure I should be telling Christians how to act, but how I believe the Bible tells human beings to act, and also like the Jews, because they recognize that their values come. It's a very powerful idea. So all of there's sort of like a three-way power struggle. There's Edom, there's Israel, and there's Ishmael, or Ishmael, as maybe you say in English. And the roots of modern nation states and even religions go back to the book of Genesis, where the roots of Israel are Jacob, whose name is literally changed into that. We know Jacob's twin brother is Esau, or Esau in Hebrew. And Jewish tradition tells us that Esau becomes Edom. He becomes a separate nation. And of course, Ishmael, who is Isaac's half-brother through Hagar, he becomes the Arabs and the Ishmaelites and Islam, actually. So the origins, it's like a three-way race in history between the original monotheistic faith and the two faiths that come from it. And ironically, one might think, it's sort of counterintuitive. From the Jewish perspective, it seems to be the closest threat are the Ishmaelites, because we live as a state of Israel surrounded by an Arab world that Jewish tradition teaches is descended from Ishmael. By the way, the Arabs also believe that. That's interesting. It's one of the few things that Jews and Arabs agree on, is the notion that they come from Ishmael, and we say they come from Ishmael. And today there are spiritual descendants of the Arabs who are Muslims, and then there are physical descendants who are they're spiritual descendants of Ishmael who are Muslims, and most Muslims aren't Arabs, while there are the more physical descendants who we say literally are the Arab people. So there's two offshoots, so that seems to be like the closer, threat, because we're living literally amongst these people and terrorism and all the things going on. But the reality is that the Scripture talks about the closest rivalry is between Jacob and his twin, his fraternal twin Esau, which is sort of counterintuitive because they're full brothers, they're so close, twins. But the reality is that's considered to be the greatest rivalry from within the womb. If in the story in Genesis, when Rebecca's pregnant and she feels like this tremendous struggle going on in her stomach, and she goes to Shem and Aver, who are the descendants of Noah, to find out. Back then they didn't have ultrasound, so she goes for a spiritual ultrasound, and she gets this, Shnei Goyim v'vitnech. The Bible says 2 nations are in your womb, and one will dominate the other, and the other will throw this one off, and it's this huge sort of cosmic end of days prophecy. She's just probably thinking, I just want to know if the heartbeat's normal. But from the minute they come out of the womb, we know that Esau comes out first, with Jacob holding his heel, which is where his name comes from in Hebrew. And the rivalry begins at the very beginning. And if you follow the text through, it talks about how at an early age, Esau, even though, they're twins, one comes out earlier, so the Esau is the firstborn. The firstborn has the responsibility of running the family business. He's really supposed to be creating the Jewish people. And he gets the double inheritance in Jewish law, the firstborn. We know that the story of Esau sells his firstborn responsibility to his brother for some food. That's how little he cares about the responsibility. And then you fast forward to the much more well-known story of when Jacob steals the birthright from when Isaac is old and blind, and he puts the goat skin on his hands, and he dresses as his brother, and he goes in, and his father hears his voice. Isaac can't see, but he says, you sound, Hakol Kol Yaakov. The voice is the voice of Jacob, Hayadayim Yadei Esav, but the hands are the hands of Esau. And it's interesting, by the way, that there's simple reading of that story is you sound like one, you feel like the other, because he's blind. But the rabbis say there's many layers to the Torah, the Bible, and you can peel off. And what's interesting is to go a little bit deeper when it says the voice is the voice of Jacob. So Jacob is the embodiment of Israel. And voice is the ultimate expression, by the way, of being human. Speech is a uniquely human thing. Only human beings really speak. Animals communicate, they don't really speak. The ability to think abstractly. And the statement that's really being said is the power of the Jewish people is the power of spirituality. That's their power in the world. Never big in numbers or physical power, but great in ideas and spiritual strength. Whereas the hand is the hand of Esau. And the human hand, by the way, is also unique in that having a thumb facing your index finger, a long thumb gives unique manual dexterity that only humans have. Even primates don't have it. But it represents physical power. And we're being told right at that moment that there's this huge, the rivalry we already know, but the different strengths are being emphasized, that the Jewish strength is the spiritual strength, that Esau is going to be physical. And when Esau is born, the description of Esau in the Bible, that he's going to live by his sword. He's always associated with physical strength and also with being a very smooth-talking guy. He's called Sayed Bapiv in the Bible, that he hunts with his mouth. And that means not that he literally hunts with his mouth, but that he's a great talker. But I always say he's the worst person to play poker with, whereas we say Jacob is the easiest. He's the straight guy, and Esau is the more deceptive one in the story. Interestingly enough, in that story, Jacob fools his brother. The king of deceit is fooled by someone who's very straight. But from that split, we see the strengths of the Jewish people and the descendants of Esau. And Jewish tradition says that Esau turns into Edom. His descendants are called Edom. The Edomites in history live across in what is today basically Jordan and Saudi Arabia. And from Edom come a number of descendants. The Bible gives their lineage. He's considered to be a great nation with a lot of merit because he is Jacob's brother and he's descended from that original line of Abraham. He has certain merits. The Jews are prevented from going to war against the Edomites when they enter the land of Israel, that kind of thing. So he's considered to be a very powerful force in human history, but nonetheless a force that is in every way antithetical, ironically, given that they're from the same genetic stock to the Jewish people. Jacob is spiritual, Esau is physical, Edom is physical, and they're at odds with each other, and that rivalry goes throughout history. But if I can just go a little further into the narrative, it's interesting. They separated. We know that Jacob has to run away from his brother after he steals the blessing. He runs all the way back to Haran. He goes to Turkey. That's where he meets his wives, Rachel and Leah. He lives with his uncle Lavan. He accumulates his tremendous wealth and his large family of his 12 sons. And then they're reunited. And in that story also is a tremendous pattern that's laid out in that when they meet, we know that Jacob, in expectation of what might happen, there's that expression, time dulls all pain, except with Esau, who bears a grudge for a very long time. This is 22 years later. They haven't seen each other, twin brothers. And the narrative in the Bible describes how Esau is coming out with 400 men, like this whole cavalry thing. And Jacob follows his famous three-pronged strategy where he sends gifts because he knows that Esau, being very physical, loves his stuff. And then he prepares for war. He divides his camp up. If one side is attacked, then half the family will survive. And then, most importantly, he knows God runs the world, so he prays. And the Bible describes the meeting. And this is one of the most, in terms of the future of the relationship between Jacob and Esau's descendants, this is the story. They meet and they kiss. Contrary to what we might expect, there is no conflict at the time. There's these very interesting dots appear above the Hebrew words in the text. It's really bizarre. Like it's in the text, and normally there's no vowel sounds or anything in a Torah scroll. But above those words are these dots, and all kinds of interesting rabbinic interpretation, some of which is allegorical, that Esau tries to bite Jacob's neck. It doesn't necessarily mean literally. But in that particular moment, one of the most famous statements is made. There's a great medieval commentator called Rashi, who lived 1,000 years ago in France. And Rashi quotes, he says, Omar Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai was a great rabbi who lived almost more than 1,800 years ago, who he himself lived in the land of Israel during the Roman occupation. And having badmouthed the Romans, he had to go into hiding in a cave with his son for 12 years. While in hiding, tradition teaches they wrote the Zohar, which is called the Radiance, which is the most important book of Kabbalah, of Jewish mysticism. So he knew Esau's descendants very well. I sort of got ahead of myself because in Jewish tradition, Edom becomes Rome. And he's quoting Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who says, Halacha chi biyadua, it's a law, like gravity, that Esau hates Jacob. And it's a huge point because we're being told that within the psyche of Esau is a deep resentment, jealousy, rivalry, hatred of his twin brother that carries on through his descendants all throughout history. And we're being told it's a huge point because although Ishmael's descendants, Islam and Arabs are right around in the neighborhood, the real rivalry is between Jacob and his brother Esau and Esau's descendants, who are the Edomites. Ultimately, Edom becomes Rome. Rome, we know, doesn't exist anymore as an empire, but Western civilization, while not being wholly Roman, there's Greek influence, there's all kinds of interesting stuff in there, but Jewish tradition basically holds that in its essence, the biggest impact on Western civilization is Esau and Rome. And therefore it is ultimately the biggest rivalry, which is very, very interesting. If I could I'm just going, it's okay, keep going on and on here. Let's go back to the narrative is very interesting because when they meet, so Esau and Jacob, they hug and they kiss, and then Esau makes an offer to Jacob. And he says, come live with me. Come to Mount Seir, which is where he lived, and we'll go into business together. I always make a joke about it. Imagine the Roman Empire with a Jewish CEO. They'd still be in business today, making a profit. And Jacob recognizes this isn't going to work. And by the way, a lot of the rabbinic commentators says that he should have maybe not taken up the offer, but maybe given his daughter Dinah to Esau as a wife, because a good woman can straighten out a guy, They say behind every great man is a totally exhausted wife and a completely surprised mother-in-law. Anyway, but for whatever reason, Jacob declines, thinking this is dangerous. My brother really bears a lot of enmity towards me, or if my kids play with his, it's going to be bad for their upbringing. So he tells him, you go on ahead. I'll catch up later. And here the commentators jump all over this again, like Rashi again. And Rashi's always answering the most obvious questions you should be asking. He assumes you know the text well. And the great medieval commentator Rashi jumps in and says, wait a second. If Jacob says to Esau, you go on ahead, I'll catch up later, and Rashi knows that we know that Jacob never goes to live with Esau. He's just trying to get rid of him. Like the rabbis even say, if someone stops you, asks you where you're going and you suspect that they might want to rob you, tell them that you're going much further than you really are. They'll wait for you down the road for ambush and you'll have turned off the highway beforehand. So that's what's really going on. But at that moment, again, it's one of those great pivotal moments in history where the rabbis say the actions of the fathers are assigned to the children. Things that happen in this story reverberate throughout history, just as the rivalry between Jacob and Esau is felt throughout the relationship between Jews, Western civilization, and therefore Christianity. So too, when Jacob says to Esau, you go on ahead, I'll catch up later, the Talmud jumps in and says, until that moment, Jacob and Esau were supposed to walk together as equals throughout history. His descendants, the Jewish people, Edom, Rome, would have been equals in history. But when Jacob says to Esau, you go on ahead, I'll catch up later, it's sort of the Jews saying to Esau's descendants, you go on ahead in history, you dominate the world, you build your empires, which is, by the way, what, just a purely historical level, putting all the biblical narrative aside, the whole story of civilization, and I'm not being Western-centric because I'm a Westerner, is the West, especially the descendants of the Roman Empire, Europe, going out and colonizing the rest of the world. It's not the Japanese coming to Europe or the Chinese or the Indians or Africa. It's Esau with his unquenchable desire to control and get his stuff, going out and physically dominating the world. So Jacob says to Esau, you go on ahead, I'll catch up later, meaning you go on ahead and build your empire, get your stuff. The ultimate stuff is land, by the way. They like, flat screen TVs too, but they want the land. And we'll get it later, meaning later, by the way, from the Jewish perspective, the Jewish people haven't gotten their stuff. We don't really want our stuff. We want spiritual stuff. The reward comes to the Jewish people in the Messianic era. And until that time, Esau will go as Rome, as Western civilization, conquer, colonize, as Christianity spread the word. That's part of the spiritual conquest. Although from a Jewish perspective, that's not necessarily the bad part, because that's spreading monotheism around the world, albeit sometimes very brutally, though, I have to say, as a historian. Not necessarily with love, But that's part of when you put Esau's personality with spiritual conquest, you get sometimes a lot of very militant or belligerent, spreading of the word, although that's not the case today, but certainly. But that's the background. It's amazing when you rewind the whole story back to the beginning, you see that this rivalry, which is totally uneven, fast forward through history, it's Jewish people living either under the domination of Rome, and historically we know the Jews rebelled more against the Romans than any other people in human history. Almost no one appreciates that point. But once Jerusalem was destroyed, Jews are exiled in 70, and then we have this huge revolt called the Bar Kokhba revolt from 132 to 135, which a lot of historians hold as the greatest revolt in the history of the Roman Empire. Certainly the first time the Romans are thrown out of any part of their empire is Bar Kokhba. So once we lose our country, then we end up living initially almost completely under Roman Christian domination. When Rome becomes Christian, we know it as the Byzantine Empire. Of course, then Islam comes along, and a lot of Jews end up actually in that part of the world. But from then on, the relationship has been extremely difficult, with Jews living as a minority, spread out in the diaspora, in European countries, and with the relationship deteriorating to the point of, we know, by the time they get to the Crusades, open violence and hostility that's deeply ingrained in Christian thought. But the root all goes back to something that Judaism would say the vast majority of people who hate Jews are not even really aware of why they hate the Jews. They might believe all the superstitions about, medieval accusations of, well poisoning and using Christian blood to bake matzah and Jewish economic control of the world. But on a metaphysical, spiritual level, Judaism is very clear, like Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says, that it's deeply ingrained in the subconsciousness of the descendants of Esau, this rivalry and hatred that goes back to that initial relationship. Till today, there's tremendous hostility. While the medieval accusations of well poisoning and blood libels are not generally espoused, they've morphed into accusations of extreme Israeli cruelty, oppression, apartheid, and some of the leaders in the movement, of a boycott, divestment, and sanction against Israel are churches. You have the Anglican Church, you have the Church of Scotland, you see this all the time. And it's interesting, you could almost, it'd be a great little experiment to do to see the relationship between those churches and Christianity and their relationship to the Jewish people. Because I hold my own perspective. I look at the modern pro-Israel evangelical community, which is not the whole evangelical community, but you know better than I do. But it's precisely those communities that take the Bible seriously. And the question is not a new one. We understand that in the pagan world, Jews were unique. We believed in one God. We had an absolute standard of morality. We didn't swap gods like baseball cards. We wouldn't eat their food, or we wouldn't marry their women. Jews were like, that book, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. Jews were like from Venus. And if you look at pagan writers in the Roman world describing Judaism, the overall sentiment is these people were the weirdest people in the world. Where are their idols? Where are their images? And they're so arrogant. Like, who do they think they are? Like, they're right. I mean, the basic polytheistic worldview is that reality is a popularity contest. Everyone else in the world believes in multiple gods, and they have this one little nation which believes in their one God, who's the only God, and they're telling us that our gods don't exist. And so that was a source of tremendous tension. But one would imagine that as paganism is obliterated by Christianity and Western civilization, which is not something that happens overnight, it takes centuries, that there'd be a natural movement closer to Judaism, given that the worldview of Christianity is, in its essence, with some significant differences, but it's a monotheistic Jewish worldview. So one explanation is that there is a rivalry. Called replacement theology comes out of the notion that Jews rejected Jesus, God rejected the Jews, destroyed their temple and exiled them, and the new spiritual Israel is the church. The New Testament replaces the Old Testament. It's interesting. It's a plus and a minus. It's like 2 steps forward, 1 step back. When the great medieval scholar Maimonides, who was born in Spain over 800 years ago, when he's commenting on Christianity and Islam, he says, the big benefit of these religions is before they came along, it was just us and everyone else is a polytheist. He said, now the whole world talks about one God, has a deterministic view of history, that history is a controlled process leading to a destination, the concept of redemption and final judgment. And, these are all concepts that Christianity and Islam are picked up from the Jewish people. But that's what he says, as a good side. I always add it as a negative side, but now they view they've replaced us. And that goes back to the original rivalry. So throughout history, and the history of the church is one of deep rivalry and suspicion of the Jewish people. But also, I would say, if I could add in, and I wrote about this in the first book I wrote, World Perfect, I talked about why didn't the Christian church take a worldview or act in a way that was more Jewish. And if you know, and I'm not being nasty to Christianity, but if you study the history of the medieval church, it's pretty brutal. It's the largest player in the feudal system, remarkable, unbelievably corrupt church by the time you get to the Renaissance. You know, the Medici popes and people like this. I mean, and the answer is exactly that point, because while they paid lip service to concepts that come from Judaism that are the basis of Christianity, they actually were acting in a very different way. It's a tremendous disconnect. It's almost like Carl Jung, he says, that which you dislike in yourself and other people can teach you a lot about yourself. And it could well be that on a deep, like a Jungian, the church looking at the Jews and recognizing that we're really not behaving the way the Bible's telling us to behave. Rather than feel bad about how they're behaving, let's take it out on the Jewish people. I would say that's incredibly subconscious idea. It would be a great doctoral thesis to go into. The psychoanalyzing Christian like self-hate, projecting it onto the Jews. But if you fast forward through history, once you get to a Christian community like the modern evangelical community, which takes the Bible very seriously, not just saying in terms of historical perspective, but also in terms of how you have to behave, then you see it's amazing, everything falls into place. They take the prophecies seriously. Jesus is re-Judaized. The Jewish people then get a place back in history. They behave in a way that's not only, I would say, internally ethical and moral, as the evangelical community I find are extremely straight people, but they also have a relationship with the Jews, which from my knowledge as a historian is unique in the history of Christianity. It's almost like Esau is reconciling himself with his brother and recognizing that it's not necessarily a rivalry, but a partnership, and both have a role to play in history. And they could walk together in the end of days and do a lot of good for the world, as opposed to resentment and rivalry and hatred and all the stuff that goes along with it. Well, it's interesting you mention that, because I tell this to people and they're shocked. I said, if you could beam yourself back to Europe of 1,000 years ago and say Jesus was Jewish, I mean, they would say, you crazy? That disgusting Jew Judas killed him. Jesus wasn't Jewish. You push Christians further. I mean, obviously medieval Christians were generally fairly ignorant of the entire scripture, not just the Jewish scripture, but the Christian Bible was in Latin, whatever. But it's amazing what a job the church did at de-Judaizing Jesus. And that ultimately is the cause of the greatest anti-Semitism in medieval Europe. And you see that there's always explosions of anti-Semitism around the time of Easter with the Passion plays. And that filthy Jew Judas and the Pharisees conspired to kill Jesus now, and the Jews are still conspiring in different ways, either by desecration of the host, the communion wafers, torturing them, or kidnapping Christian babies. They're still at it, fighting against the will of God. And again, whereas a segment of the Christian world, again the pro-Israel evangelical communities, weaned themselves as a connection. They've re-Judaized Jesus and weaned themselves off of those accusations. Those accusations have morphed into, okay, we can't espouse things like blood libels anymore and well poisoning, but now they've taken on there's a new blood libel. The new blood libel is that the Jews are responsible via the Jewish state Israel for all kinds of nefarious, inhuman things that are not necessarily ritual murder, but are the worst crimes against humanity, things guaranteed to get European leftists going through the roof. But it's interesting that they also have this notion of, once again, de-Judaizing Jesus. These claims were made by the Palestinian Authority years ago that Jesus was a Palestinian Arab. And you have many church groups that are openly espousing, not only anti-Israel activity, but trying to make that connection somehow that Jesus was Palestinian. Not even recognizing the origins of the term Palestinian. There's nothing, Palestinians come from the term Philistines, which was the Romans imported the terminology into the land of Israel in the 2nd century after the Bar Kokhba revolt, with only one goal in mind, having dealt with 3 major revolts of the Jews against the Romans in a period of less than 70 years, having had the Jews cause them more manpower and material losses than any people, having been officially listed as a people that is officially hostile to Roman rule and perpetually in revolt, the Romans decided, we can't seem to get rid of these people through like physically killing them off. Well, maybe what we'll do is we will cut them off from their connection to their land, because if you cut a people off from their land, it's like, cutting the blood supply off to the brain. So what they did was they banned Jews from entering Jerusalem. They renamed the city. I always say, ironically, the first Judenrein, as Hitler called it, Jew-free area of the world was Jerusalem in the 2nd century. They renamed the city Aelia Capitolina after Hadrian, the Roman general who crushed the Bar Kokhba revolt. They renamed all the cities in Israel non-Jewish names, like they took the city of Shechem, where Joseph is buried, and named it like Naples, which is a Latin version of the Greek word Neopolis, new city. Arabs can't pronounce P's today, so they call it Nablus. Interesting that Palestinians can't say Palestine, by the way. They say Palestine, ironically. And they renamed the whole country, which during the Roman occupation from Pompey Magnus in 63 BCE until early 2nd century was called Judea, the Roman province of Judea after the Jews. They renamed the whole country Philistia after the now extinct Philistines, who themselves were invaders to the land of Israel. In the book of Judges you read, they come across from the area of Greece, settle on the coast of Israel, and are pushing the Jewish people up from the coast into the hill country. But the whole thing was a deliberate attempt to de-Judaize the land of Israel and deny the Jewish people their claim. Then, fast forward in history, in the 30s, 40s, 50s, before the State of Israel was founded, the only people to use the term Palestinians were Jews. El Al was originally Palestine Airways. My wife works for Patra Travel, which was founded in 1936, Palestine Travel Agency. The Jerusalem Post charter name is the Palestine Post. In the 60s, Ahmed Sukkari, who was the head of the PLO at the time, recognizing that in order to reorient the conflict from little teeny David Israel, from 10,500 square miles of Jewish territory surrounded by 5.5 million square miles, 22 Arab states, we got to flip it over and make Israel the Goliath and the Arab minority population at that time living under Jordanian and Egyptian, by the way, largely control. The David, we got to create this Palestinian thing. So they created the terminology only in the 60s. Only in the 60s. And since that time, it's spiraled with the help of Europe and recognizing that claim. It's now reoriented the conflict to Israel's the aggressor, and the indigenous population are the Palestinians. And to the point where we've now taken it one step further and somehow connected Jesus. There's no scriptural source anywhere. Jesus is an Arab. I mean, Islam didn't even exist. The Arabs didn't even come to what's today the land of Israel until the 7th century, till 600 years after the death of Jesus. How is he a Palestinian Arab? But I think it all goes back to the same sort of projection thing of, the internal guilt and the turmoil and the rivalry. It's all sort of wrapped up in this, let's just blame the Jews and avoid responsibility for doing what we're supposed to be doing as Christians. I'll bet if you did a survey, you'd probably find that the churches most involved in this boycott, divestment, sanction stuff are the churches that are most in trouble theologically. I know more Muslims go to mosques on Friday than Anglicans go to church on Sunday, and Anglicans outnumber Muslims by like 9-1 in England. This is a church that's in really bad trouble, as probably the Church of Scotland is also. And I guess rather than deal with their own theological issues, let's do what history always does. Let's just blame the Jewish people and divert attention from our own failings. Because when you look at the narrative, there's this split. Esau goes ahead, his descendants, Edom, Rome, Christianity, they'll dominate the world. But in the end, we have this deterministic worldview of Messianic redemption. And the idea is, even though there's this three-way rivalry that begins in the book of Genesis between Ishmael, the half-brother, his descendants, Arabs, Islam, Esau, Western civilization, Christianity, in the end, the Jewish scenario points to the fact that Jacob catches up, which doesn't mean he catches up financially, which means that ultimately the descendants of both Ishmael and Esau recognize the role that Jacob plays in history as he really is the firstborn. And God really wants the Jewish people to be the people who are teaching the world about monotheism, one God, the values that come from that relationship. And they line up together behind the Jewish people. By the way, Jewish sources point out that Ishmael's descendants actually line up before Esau's descendants. And that, again, it's counterintuitive given that Ishmael seems to be so much more in our face. But the reality is, when it says when Isaac dies, it says when when Abraham dies, that Isaac and Ishmael, in that order, buried Abraham. And the rabbis who always pick apart the text say the order is significant because Ishmael is older, but the fact that he's mentioned later indicates that he recognizes that while he has a job to do in spreading the word around in his own way, the reality is the lead in that story is the Jewish people, and so too the deeper rivalry between Jacob and Esau, ultimately after Esau gets all of his stuff and conquers the world, and then realizes he's sort of spiritually empty and searching, that he will line up also and recognize that contrary to what was been maybe preached for thousands of years about God rejecting the Jewish people still have a central role to play and are supposed to be a model for the whole world to follow. And the story ends happily. There's a reconciliation between all those brothers and half-brothers, but it only comes in the end of days, in the Messianic era, and the scripture is pretty clear that it can come one of two ways. It can come in a sort of peaceful way, or it could come after a massive struggle when the nations of the world are kind of dragged, kicking and screaming, a la the Gog and Magog scenario described in Ezekiel and Zechariah. But all the prophets talk about the judgment of the nations. And Obadiah, they all mention Esau and his descendants. Those prophets not knowing what Esau would metamorphosize into, but understanding that as a huge force in history, even his descendants will line up and eventually reconcile themselves with the Jewish people and their role in history and in spirituality. So the idea is Gog and Magog is part of the whole process. The details are a little bit hazy, but the scenario seems to be that it could be that the nations of the world line up to attack Israel. By the way, that's pretty much what's going on today in the world. Just because of Ezekiel and Zechariah describe this vast horde, this mighty army, like an ocean, like it just describes, reminds me of that Lord of the Rings thing, and Helm's, the orcs coming in this huge army. It doesn't necessarily mean physical. When the prophets speak, they often speak metaphorically. And what you could have is a certain group of people fighting the Jewish people with the rest of the world lined up behind. And that's what you see happening today perfectly. Because the reality is in the world, except for the United States, which is consistently, and Micronesia, the Marshall Islands, these little, and now Canada because they have Stephen Harper, who is very pro-Israel. The reality is the only country in the world that stands between Israel and complete political isolation in the world, meaning those countries that are actively involved in destroying Israel, and those countries that are standing by, which is largely Europe, since the residual guilt for the Holocaust was worn off, are basically, is the U.S. Would the U.S., if the U.S., God forbid, were to go neutral on the Jewish state, you would have already at this moment a Gog and Magog scenario created, where even though Ishmael's descendants, the Arabs in Islam, and Esau's descendants have been a huge, they've been in conflict for over 1,000 years. The one thing that seems to unite them is they can unite to fight the Jewish people. So they're enemies of each other. They're natural enemies of each other throughout history. And yet, and you could see today, what's the one thing that you get a Euro-leftist in a room with a radical Muslim who they can't stand each other. Their whole moral, political agenda is diametrically opposed. But it comes to Israel bashing, that they'll line up, which explains why you can have a church group, Christ at the checkpoint kind of thing. These people should be the greatest natural enemy of each other historically. But again, going back to the metaphysics, on a very deep spiritual level, they recognize that we don't really like each other, but really our real beef is with Jacob. We're like offshoots. But that whole scenario is sort of already happening now. There's very little separating Gog and Magog and Ezekiel and Zechariah from what's going on in the world today. And if America were to go neutral, Israel would find itself totally isolated, and it could be that would be the scenario which would trigger a massive pressure and even physical threats against Israel. And that could be the scenario where, from the Jewish perspective, we have the Messiah appearing to sort of save the day, just as everything seems hopeless and the world is totally united against us. So what is described in a very allegorical way in the Bible could very well be playing out in the headlines in the newspapers we see today in the world, absolutely.